And how can we, as outsiders, as observers, learn the difference between a story that's there to educate and a story that's there to mislead?
Readers are much more likely to remember a story than a statistic. So then how do I avoid the danger of handpicking one story, which is a fact but not data? This is futile if rigor is not something which affects its real-world impact. So I wanted to write a book about misinformation, about how we need to make sure that we tame our biases and respond to evidence based on its scientific accuracy and not whether we like these findings. And so this highlights the importance of not being swayed by one particular study, even if it's published in the top scientific journals, because even editors and peer reviewers can make mistakes. But that reduces the totality, the humanity of a person into just the gender and ethnicity. To disentangle the two things that are frequently conflated, which is the mission, the objective, with the journey, how to get there. The solutions to misinformation are all within ourselves.
Hi, I'm Chris Caldwell, and welcome to Season 3 of Conversations on Climate. Well, Alex, thank you again so much for inviting us back into your home here to discuss your new book this time, May Contain Lies.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's great to see you again. Really enjoyed the last conversation and looking forward to this one.
Yeah, me too, absolutely. So I've read the book, thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've taken on some of its messages on board. And in that spirit, could you describe the main content of the book, but not in your own words, in the words of a peer, a trusted peer that you gave an early copy to?
Sure. A review came out in The Times just a couple of days ago, and one line from it, which was quite striking, was, "It is a timely book, and despite the nerdy statistical theories, is quite funny." So let me break this down into 3 steps. So first, it's a timely book. So why did I write this? Misinformation is a huge problem. It's produced by many, even trusted sources, and it spans not just business and finance, what we spoke about last time, but lots of other areas such as politics, science, and health advice. Second, the nerdy statistical theories is I did want to give the reader a view of statistics. I wanted to improve the reader's statistical literacy by highlighting the ways in which people can be duped by some misinformation. So I didn't want to dumb things down, even though this aims to be an accessible book. I wanted to make the reader smarter and more able to deal with misinformation going forwards. But the third bit is the really important one, which is I like the fact that the Times reviewer found the book funny. So I wanted to make sure that this book is entertaining and interesting, so it's not just something which is educational, but fun to read. So often, why academics don't have much of an impact in the real world, and then often complain, why is it that my research is not being read and people listen to this misinformation? It's your fault, right? You don't take the time to make the research accessible, so I wanted to break down complex concepts into simple language and illustrate them with everyday examples, not just academic ones.
Fantastic. And as you say, it's a break from what you're best known for, like Grow the Pie, fantastic book, and your day job as a professor of economics at London Business School. What was the origin story of this particular book, and why was it important to get these ideas out right now?
Yeah, so I never set out to be a professor of misinformation or to write about misinformation. It was something that I stumbled across. So one thing that I'm particularly passionate about is using research to address real-world problems. So I've often, in my field of sustainable finance, used not only my own research, but also the research of other scholars in my discussions with policymakers and companies and investors. And what really struck me was the reaction I would get would depend almost entirely on whether they liked the findings of research and not its actual accuracy. So if there was a study they liked the results of, they would say, this is the world's best study. And even if I wrote some of the studies, I would never call my own research the world's best, but people were overly excited when it gave them a message they wanted to hear. And in contrast, when a message was more nuanced or if it contradicted their prior viewpoint, they would say, this is just academic, it has no relation to the real world. And so when I think about this, and I think, well, what is my day job as a finance professor and more recently a journal editor? If it's to produce the most rigorous research or if it's to publish the most rigorous research by others, this is futile if rigor is not something which affects its real-world impact. So I wanted to write a book about misinformation, about how we need to make sure that we tame our biases and respond to evidence based on its scientific accuracy and not whether we like these findings. And the more that I dug into this, the more I realised that this is not just a problem in economics, but in so many other areas.
Absolutely. And one of the other areas is politics. You opened your book with a great story of when you were called to give expert evidence to Parliament.
Yeah.
And there was one particular, there's many interesting lines in it,
Yeah.
but one particular where you said that you honestly answered that you didn't know the answer to a particular question. And it seemed to be taking people by surprise. Why did you lead with that particular story, the particular anecdote? How does it frame the problem that the book's trying to solve?
Sure, and let me give a small summary of the anecdote and then I'll explain why I chose to lead with that one. So a few years ago there was a UK government inquiry into corporate governance, the way companies are run. So I submitted some written evidence to this inquiry, and on the back of that I was invited to testify in the House of Commons, which was a great honour to get to share the findings of research with this important committee. So I got there early because I was nervous, I wanted to swat up, and the witness before me was the Trade Unions Congress, and they referred to a study which sounded striking. So they found the smaller the gap between the CEO's pay and the average worker pay, the better the company performance. So this was initially music to my ears, because a lot of my own work in Grow the Pie is about the importance of treating your workers fairly, and it indeed seems that a lower pay gap is fair treatment. This could be another weapon in my arsenal when I was trying to persuade companies to treat their employees well. But when I wanted to look up that research, I looked up the very authors that the Trade Unions Congress quoted in their written evidence, and the paper found completely the opposite. So I was shocked. I thought, well, am I so nervous that I'm misreading the study? But no, the findings were as clear as day. And what had happened was the witness had quoted a half-finished study. The finished version had come out, and after going through peer review and correcting its mistakes, it had come up with the opposite result. Higher pay gaps actually lead to higher performance. But because the Trade Unions Congress had a public position against pay gaps, they wanted to quote the half-finished data even though it had been overturned. So this taught me two things. So the first was that any report, even one published by a House of Commons Select Committee, can be biased. So even though the Trade Unions Congress had given this tainted evidence, it still got published in the final report of the committee. And so anything written by a government is human. And so these people are humans, they have their biases, and they might have felt that pay was too high, which is why they launched the inquiry to begin with. So even trusted sources may not actually be trustworthy. And the second is this phrase that we often hear, research shows that, or studies show that. Now that is often seen as proof, but you can find almost any study to support anything you want to support. So the fact that there is one piece of evidence that supports your conclusion does not mean that it's true. There could be lots of other evidence which finds the opposite, but you are hiding this from the reader because you have a particular agenda that you want to push.
Absolutely. And in this world of increasing digitization of everything, we have more and more information out there, more and more misinformation, but on the other hand, we also have more and more access to quality information. But even so, in the world of misinformation, we seem to be having less trust in information in general. Like, how do you explain that paradox where we have better quality available, but we also have misinformation and it's getting worse?
It's indeed a paradox. You might think, well, the solution to misinformation is to get more information, right? We become more informed, and nowadays we have so much access to information, we can just look something up on our phone. Increasingly, scientific research is now open access. It's not behind a paywall. Anybody can see this. We can get information not just through reading stuff, but podcasts where leading scientists and authors can be interviewed, so information is accessible through many, many forms. So why might it be that misinformation has got worse? It's because of how we search for information and how we respond to information. So a big part of the start of the book is on confirmation bias. So that involves two things. Number one, we're biased in how we seek out information. So if I'm a right-winger, I might only look for the Telegraph or Fox News. Yes, I've got lots of information sources. Now it's not just the UK, but I could look at the US media, but I'm only going to be in an echo chamber. I'm only going to be following and reading people who accord with my viewpoint. The second part of confirmation bias is how we respond to information. So even if information is shoved into my face, how I react to it depends on whether I like its findings. I might accept something uncritically if I want it to be true, or I might reject something out of hand if I don't like its findings, or I might just read it with a critical eye trying to tear it apart. So what this means is that we don't respond to information in a rational, unbiased manner, a manner in which we all become more informed. Instead, we only look for information that we'll like the sound of, and when we see the information, we will only be swayed by it and persuaded by it if we like the results that it claims.
Okay, so going back to Grow the Pie, is a very kind of a rationalist book. With your time again, would you go back and would you add a little bit more of this behavioural psychology to it, or are you happy as that one was and this is an evolution?
Well, I actually, in the first draft of the book, in the first proposal, I did include this. So I included the ladder of misinference, which is one of the big things in May Contain Lies. It's about the different ways in which people can be misinformed, the difference between statements, facts, data, evidence and proof. But the publisher and also some trusted people who I asked to critique my outline said that this was trying to do too many things in one book, and I fully agree with them. So I don't want to blame the publisher and say, oh, if I had hindsight I would have added this, but already the book did cover lots of different things. It looked at not only the case for purpose, but also the importance of doing it in a profitable manner, in contrast to some books which might be entirely all-purpose or entirely all-profit. So this already made the book somewhat nuanced, and I think if I was to add that additional dimension, it might have been too much for the reader to handle. So that's why I wanted to do a quite separate book on this topic of misinformation, and it also allows me to go beyond just sustainable finance to all of the other topics we've already mentioned.
And one of the kind of key themes that runs through it is the idea of confirmation bias. And you can appreciate, you've called me out on this before. You know, I published on LinkedIn, put up an article that I really wanted to be true. It was about ESG and mirroring what higher ESG scores means higher stock market scores, and just it felt good to me. It was what I wanted to believe. It came from a very reputable source, so I pushed it out, and you popped back and said, "Hey, Chris, no, this has been discredited, and you need to look at the research." I said, "Okay, of course, thank you very much." Don't look.
But before you go, and I was duped by the same paper. So that same paper was featured prominently in Grow the Pie. It was published in a top peer-reviewed journal. So I myself was somebody who was subject to confirmation bias. So it's not just you, it could be people, even experts in sustainability like me. And so this highlights the importance of not being swayed by one particular study, even if it's published in the top scientific journals, because even editors and peer reviewers can make mistakes.
Right. And how would someone like me or our viewers, how can we spot those blind spots? So what should we be looking at to try and avoid making those mistakes?
I think it is to try to make sure we glean from a large body of work rather than particular papers, linked to the idea earlier that you can always corral one paper to try to find something that you would like to be true. And in particular for this particular paper, one of the authors has written many things about sustainability, and not all of those things were seen to be rigorous. And again, a lot of this came out afterwards, so after I'd published my first book, because I did feature a lot of his research in it, but now these things are starting to be overturned, in particular by people who are a bit more discerning about sustainability, and so that might be one particular flag. So one thing that I ask, one simple tip that I ask, is to imagine that the study found the opposite result. Would the author still be willing to publish it? Now, for this particular author, everything he writes is pro-sustainability, and he makes a lot of money from this. So he gets consulting jobs, and he's launched a consultancy, and everything here was based on the idea that sustainability pays off. So he would never write an article saying that certain sustainability themes don't pay off. Whereas I, despite being a sustainability advocate, have often written on LinkedIn that certain pro-sustainability studies are not necessarily as rigorous as they might claim. So what matters to me is whether the research is rigorous rather than whether it supports my own pro-sustainability views.
Okay, and so linking onto that theme, at the heart of the book is it's the deconstruction on misuse of facts and misinformation, and a lot of the books and articles that you deconstructed, were things that I was swallowing whole. So, but just for a little bit of kind of background for the audience, one of the ones I think most people will be familiar with is kind of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 Hours. Like, are you telling me that I will never be a concert pianist? Why is that wrong?
Unfortunately, I am telling you that, Chris. And before I tell you that, let me say that this was something I myself believed. So I heard of this 10,000 hours rule that you can become an expert on anything as long as you're willing to graft and put in 10,000 hours of hard work. And so why do so many people, including me, believe that rule? Because of confirmation bias. It confirms what we like to be true and think to be true. So when we're kids, we're told, practice makes perfect, you can do anything you set your mind to. And nowadays we're all about empowerment, about the whole idea is that if you want something hard enough, you can achieve it, right? We see on Instagram a lot of stories of people who might not have been healthy, might have been overweight, and because they put a lot of effort into diet and exercise, they managed to transform their body. And these things are inspiring, and they're about the amounts of hard work which we certainly should be thinking about. However, hard work is sometimes actually detrimental, is if we're putting the work in areas in which we are very unlikely to succeed. So if you were to try to become a concert pianist, or I was to become a professional ballet dancer, no matter how much effort I put in, and no matter how passionate I am about ballet dancing, I might not be successful. So the whole idea of highlighting the problems with the 10,000 hours rule is absolutely not to debunk the idea of hard work. Certainly as a professor, I want to encourage students that they can learn new skills if they put the effort to it, but not to give the black and white view that all you need is effort. Sometimes what you need is some talent, some skill. Also, the 10,000 hours idea puts emphasis on the quantity of practice and not the quality. You've got loads of people who you can see in the gym, they spend 2 hours in the gym, they're probably on their phone much of the time, or they're not actually doing particularly challenging weights or runs. Instead, it may well be half an hour is more than enough if it's guided by a coach and is something really pushing yourself outside your comfort zone.
And so you build your analysis around the ladder of errors, where you've got kind of three terms, kind of facts, data, evidence, that a lot of people kind of use interchangeably.
Yeah.
Could you kind of describe the differences, like describe the ladder of errors?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one reason for introducing this ladder was that I've read some other misinformation books, and they're good, right? I learned from them, but sometimes you come away bewildered because they give you a laundry list of all the different ways in which we can fall for misinformation, and that makes it really hard for you to remember and put into practice if I remember there's 24 ways in which I might be misinformed. So I highlight 4 different missteps. So the first is the difference between statements and facts. So if somebody quotes something, did they actually say this? So is a statement backed up by a lot of evidence? Sometimes some of the most famous quotes by Mark Twain or whoever, did they actually say them? Not actually the case if you go back and fact check it. Now that's one step which most readers will know. Without reading the book, we know to check the facts. But it's the 3 other steps that you mentioned, Chris, which are the most novel. The second step is the difference between facts and data. So even if something is 100% accurate, it might still be misleading because it's one cherry-picked example. And this is important not just for books, but also for my own profession, right? We often like to teach with case studies. We like to find the case study that illustrates a point in the most vivid and memorable way, but that is misleading unless it's backed up by large-scale data. So that goes to the next step of the ladder. Isn't the solution to look at large-scale data, many cases, not just a single case? Well, the answer is no, because correlation does not imply causation. So if we look at, say, sustainability and performance, if I find over a list of 1,000 companies, the more sustainable ones do better in terms of profits, is it sustainability causes profits? Or is it the more profitable you are, the more you can act sustainably, for example, cutting your carbon emissions? Or is it there's a third factor that drives both? Maybe a great CEO both improves the sustainability of a firm, but also improves profits. Now, everybody knows that correlation does not imply causation, but we forget this when our confirmation bias is at play and there's a result that we want to be true. And so the fourth and final step is the difference between evidence and proof. So even if you've nailed a result in one particular context, this might not apply in other settings. For example, one of my early papers found that employee satisfaction leads to higher future financial performance, and I do some tests to suggest that this is more likely to be causation, not just correlation. But then people jumped on that study and said, oh, this guy has proven that ESG always pays off. I hadn't proven anything of the sort. I'd looked at one particular dimension of ESG, which is employee satisfaction. Does that naturally extend to biodiversity or Catholic values or animal rights? Not necessarily. I'd looked at one dimension rather than everything under the ESG umbrella.
Okay. This actually, it brings up kind of an interesting kind of difficulty with all of this, that kind of traditional economics and what we're taught is we should specialize, and the world works on the basis of specialization, and we have as a society been kind of outsourcing truth to journalists, to academics, to researchers. But this suggests we all need to kind of take that back in-house and do more kind of fact checking ourselves. Now, how can we do that in reality? It just seems like a pretty inefficient thing to do. So kind of two questions from that is one, how can we do that in our own lives? And second is there not a better way? Could we not try and fix the gatekeepers?
Yeah, so I think one way to answer that is to say academics are people too. So what I mean by that is that they are subject to their own biases. So you might think these are perfect scientific researchers. Why they went into the profession is they want to pursue science. And that will be true for the vast majority of academics, but also some of them will want to get famous. They want to give viral TED Talks and write best-selling books. So even somebody who's a scientist has the same incentives as maybe a journalist or a talking head or an author. They want to be famous, and if you give a message that people want to be true, they're much more likely to recommend your book and to sell it. I think the second issue is to think also that producers of information are no different from any other type of profession. So this means that we can't outsource things. So do we want to outsource the letting out or the selling of our property to our estate agent? Well, not necessarily, because the estate agent might have different objectives from us. They might always want the quickest possible sale. They're not too concerned about the price, so they might encourage you to accept too low of an offer because you're the one who's suffering much more if you sell it for too little. So you might have to exercise discernment yourself when you want to think about, do I want to accept a particular offer? This might be the same for a travel agent. The travel agent might want to upsell you on various additions to your holiday. A fitness professional might want to sell you additional supplements. So with all of these things, when you have what we call in economics a principal agent problem, you have misalignment between two things. The principal, who is somebody who is sort of in charge, and the agent is the person they're appointing. You always need to be skeptical about the agent that you're appointing. And here, if you think the general public is the principal and academics or journalists are the agent who we are, quotes, appointing to tell us the truth and to inform us, we need to recognise that these potential conflicts are always going to be in existence. And that's why the goal of the book is to say, well, how can I empower you as the person on the street who doesn't have a PhD in statistics, who doesn't have a lot of time to ask tons and tons of questions and to delve into the footnotes? What are some simple things that you can ask in order to figure out whether something is believable or not? And we've already come up with one such question. Would the authors have written the study had it come up with the opposite result? So the Trade Unions Congress would never say high pay gaps are good for you, and nor would this professor have ever written something saying sustainability does not pay off.
Yeah, no, well, it's funny, when you talked about the trade union pay gap working in the direction that I felt was correct, I instinctively went, oh no, that sounds right. But when you said it actually worked in the opposite direction, my instinct was, oh, that's correlation, not causation. The two things don't. It's just the way the brain is wired up. That's an interesting way of looking at it. You say that narratives and descriptions, stories, are very powerful, very, very suggestive, and potentially very, very misleading.
Yeah.
But you construct your book through a series of stories. Why did you make that choice, bearing in mind the subject matter? And how can we, as outsiders, as observers, learn the difference between a story that's there to educate and a story that's there to mislead?
I think I'd turn the last phrase that I had on its head and say readers are people too. So readers are much more likely to remember a story than a statistic. So stories have just been with us for decades, centuries. So the oral tradition, before we had writing, people would just pass on principles with stories to their children. That's how we would communicate. They are memorable, they're vivid, they bring things to life. So my first TEDx talk, The Social Responsibility of Business, I start with a story on how Marks and Spencer went over and above and how they treated their employees. So then how do I avoid the danger of handpicking one story, which is a fact but not data? I then presented the large-scale evidence behind that, which was my research on the link between employee satisfaction and long-term firm value. So every time I do this in the book, I start with a story. I try to highlight the general principle behind it and what's the evidence behind that general principle. That's in contrast to some books which will only have the story and not the evidence, or if they have evidence, it will be one particular study which might not have been peer-reviewed or might have a lot of flaws in it. So I want to make sure that the evidence that I have is the highest quality scientific evidence, and often not just one paper, but a broad body of evidence.
Okay. And you mentioned before there's a pressure on people to be having a neat narrative or like a punchline.
Yeah.
Do you see that in the foundation of the production of the information, or is that just a way of in the storytelling, in the narrative? Because there's a difference between the people who share the stories and the people who create the information in the first place. Is that a problem that's in both places? So the researchers, the people who are out there doing the research, as well as the storytellers, or is it more in the storytelling?
Historically, I would have said it's more in the storytelling rather than the producers of research. So out of the spectrum of academics, a large majority of academics have no real interest in conveying their ideas to the real world. They choose this job because they like mathematical abstraction, they like to communicate with other academics, they don't want the challenge of making something accessible to a different audience. They're not bad people, that's just not their goal in life. Their comparative advantage is to do things in a rigorous way for other academics. And so in the past, I would have said that it's the disseminators. This might be a journalist wanting to write an article. It might be an author who wants to write a book. And often to write these books, you often try to quote academic research in order to make your book sound rigorous, but you're only going to quote the ones that are supportive of your story. And you might quote it in a very simple way. Somebody could quote my paper and say, I've proven that ESG always pays off, omitting the fact that I only looked at employee satisfaction. But why did I say the word historically a couple of times? I think things are changing. So rightly, I think academics now have greater expectation to have more of an impact on the real world, but then this leads you to giving simple sound bites. You could look at other people who've become famous and see how by giving a message that people want to be true, you can get quite a lot of fame. Also, some of the problems are with the journal editors. So in the field of sustainability, I've seen tons and tons of sustainability papers being published where they don't have the scrutiny that I would expect of the top academic journals. Why? Because now sustainability is so popular, there's a lot of pressure on editors to publish papers in sustainability. Some of them have no idea about sustainability. Some of the papers published contradict the real world, but because professors often don't interact with the real world, they will not understand these contradictions. Papers will get published, and then other papers will cite the published papers and use that as a justification for an example or for an assumption which makes no real sense. Contrast that with when I wrote my sustainability paper about 15 years ago. So back then, nobody cared about sustainability, and I was forced to go through even more hurdles than a traditional paper would have had to, because the profession back then was not as accommodating with sustainability. But even though that might have seemed like purgatory at the time, that is now really useful to me, because then when I'm to talk about my research with discerning audiences and they ask me a lot of questions, a lot of these questions I was needing to answer and to address in the research process, because had I not addressed them, then the editor would not have published my paper.
Interesting. So do you think that there might be a pressure on academics, researchers, to be publishing information that is aligned with kind of social norms and ignoring data that would be contrary to that?
Unfortunately, yes. So the sustainability papers that I see, and I see most of them just because this is my field and so I'm interested in those papers, they are much more likely to find that sustainability pays off than it doesn't. In another field that I work on, diversity, equity, inclusion, you might see more papers which find one rather than the other. Now, there are still some great papers in top scientific journals which find contradictory results to the popular narrative, but they don't get as much airtime as the ones which might be popular. They might be drowned up by research published in less scientific journals, or done by non-academics to begin with, consultancies like McKinsey, whose goal might not be scientific inquiry, but advocacy. They will put out what will give them good public relations, and that's what goes with the zeitgeist of the time.
Interesting, okay. So just a little kind of diversion, if you may, into the world of AI. So kind of advocates of AI will say that it's a whole new world. We get a whole new ways of presenting information. You get unbiased computers looking at data, giving unbiased results. But detractors will say that, well, it just makes stuff up, and it's a fantasist, and the data. It only looks at data through the data that is trained upon, so therefore there will be biases in there. Where do you stand on how AI's role in ultimately kind of solving the problem we're talking about today?
So like anything, I think there's costs and benefits. So you'll have these people who are completely pro-AI and people who are completely anti, but in reality, it's somewhere in the middle. So I think there are definite benefits. So through AI, through something like ChatGPT, you can find the research on a particular topic, and what they will try to do is to look at the consensus of, say, the link between vaccination and autism. However, one of the challenges is sometimes AI will just go with what it sees out there, and if something is mentioned very, very frequently, and it might be mentioned very frequently because people like it, even if it's not true, that might get more weight on the AI when it looks out there for the types of evidence and the types of research that it sees. Another problem with AI is that this particularly generative AI, that can produce misinformation. So I've already alluded to cases in which, say, a Mark Twain or an Albert Einstein or a Thomas Edison were attributed with quotes that they never said. Nowadays, it might be really easy for AI to write something in the style of a particular famous author or politician and be passed off as something that they said when this wasn't actually true. So myself, when I was submitting evidence to another select committee inquiry, not the corporate governance one we mentioned at the start, but one focused on executive pay, I was misquoted in completely the opposite direction for what my evidence said, and so that's something which I think is even more of a challenge when we have AI.
Interesting. And also, so in the world of academia and specifically, AI has been talked about quite a lot as being able to do largely unbiased peer reviews, and there's also been warnings about AI's role in actual writing of papers. Like there was quite a famous one that came up recently with the radiology case reports. I don't know if you saw it, but halfway through a published document, a sentence came up where the AI was apologising for not being able to finish this section, and that got published. It was in a peer-reviewed paper. Where do you think that AI will ultimately come out on the academia, on the production of knowledge, production of information?
I think, like everything, it should be a tool, but it should be only a tool. It should not replace the master of the tool. So just like we now have, say, Excel spreadsheets that can analyze company data, and this can now not just be financial data, but ESG data. But if we just left the decision to an algorithm, we could have problems. We can have issues where companies know what data the algorithm uses, and they will boost the particular metrics that the algorithm's looking at. It could be demographic diversity and not socioeconomic or cognitive diversity. And so what do the best people do? They will use spreadsheets and data, but there's still going to be human judgment in making sure that you're going to be making your investment decision informed by the data, but not exclusively swayed by the data. And that's similar to how I might use AI as a research tool myself. So I'm at the moment researching, I'm writing the 15th edition of my textbook, Principles of Corporate Finance, and I want to update the examples, and I might ask ChatGPT to find me a new example of a particular phenomenon. Now, after doing that, then I will research that example myself, because the AI might have a hallucination. Sometimes AI gets things wrong. So I asked it the other day, when did United Airlines own Hertz? Because I wanted to use that as an example of a bad merger. And I know that they owned it at some point in time, but the AI told me it's never owned Hertz. Why? Maybe they're trained on the current data, and the fact that United Airlines sold Hertz recently means that it had forgotten it ever owned it. So when you see something in the AI, make sure that you cross-reference it, but it's still a useful first step to give you a particular example, and then you know to research that particular example rather than having to wade into something unknown.
Yeah, but if we're taking going back to conversation on climate, taking climate as a particular domain, in your book you suggest that evidence and consensus are approaching proof that man-made climate change is real, approaching a fact. But you also give examples, and more historic than current, but that belief and public understanding and belief isn't matching the same pace as the general scientific consensus. Could you explain why?
Yes. So this is because data and evidence can never be considered in a vacuum. They often come with identities and cultural meanings. And so this is the case for climate change. So one of the best documentaries on climate change, very fact-based, very well-researched, was An Inconvenient Truth. But because this starred Al Gore, this immediately meant that some Republicans thought, well, this is something that I shouldn't be believing, only people like them, Democrats, are believing, and so this failed to disentangle the actual evidence from the identity. Similarly, there was a video which says 97% of scientists believe that man-made climate change is real. Ted Cruz does not. Haha, let's laugh at Ted Cruz for being a climate change denier. But then this meant that this is something that a true Republican should be skeptical about. And people like the them versus us underdog story, this might lead some Republicans to think, okay, we are here in a minority. There might be some misinformation being peddled. There are some true believers who are willing to fight the good fight, like Ted Cruz, who are supporting this anti-misinformation campaign, and I should support it myself. So then climate change does not become an issue of what is true, but which side are you on? Do people like us or people like them believe it? So what is the antidote to this? Well, firstly, it could be for the climate change message to be given by somebody neutral, or actually by some Republicans. So there have been Republican politicians who've set up bodies trying to highlight the importance of climate change and how everybody should take action against this, because this is a global issue. It's not an issue of identity politics. Also, you might highlight how the solution to climate change are not things such as taxation and regulation, which Republicans might be skeptical towards, but Republican values of innovation, ingenuity, coming up with things such as hydrogen planes or ways to capture carbon and store it in deep geological rock formations. And so that's something which accords with Republican values and makes them much more willing to hear the evidence for what it is, rather than thinking the evidence is from an agenda that they should be opposed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was a point in time where climate change wasn't particularly political. You had people for their own reasons wanting, on both sides of the aisle, wanting to take a particular stance, wanted to take action on it. We seem to have maybe An Inconvenient Truth is one of those catalysts that nudged in the other direction because of not because of the message, but because of the messenger.
Yeah, I find this really bizarre because I myself generally believe in economics and the teaching of economics, which generally you might think Republicans are supportive of, supply and demand and so on. But one basic tenet of economics is externalities. And if something is harming wider society, it is just good for whole of society to try to tax it and to regulate it. And we have taxation and regulation in other settings. And these are things that correct market failures. And good economists recognize that markets work, but when markets are imperfect, then we need to address those imperfections. So I don't see anything about the climate change narrative which seems to be just against Republican values, any more than I don't think that that tobacco is a particularly Republican thing, that there's more Republicans who are pro-smoking than might be Democrats, certainly not here in the UK, which I know much more. So I don't see any particular reason why this is something that should be so polarising, but potentially because of the messaging, it has become polarising even though it shouldn't be.
Is it too late to imagine a world where it can be depolarized?
I don't think so, and so this is why. So what I'm trying to highlight in the book is there's relatively simple solutions here. We don't require everybody to get PhDs in environmental science. I don't have myself, or PhDs in statistics, but just to make sure that the messaging is detached from the actual identity.
Okay, but we'd also bear in mind that there's an awful lot of kind of special interests and actually an awful lot of money coming into this from particular groups, particular nations. How do we kind of navigate that path where you may be thinking on one side going, well, we're well-meaning, we're trying to kind of solve this issue, but on the other side you've got an awful lot of money who are sitting there protecting their own interests. So how do you deal with holding politics to account for kind of that type of special interest?
I think it's to step into other people's shoes and show empathy, which is something which is often missing from these discussions where we want to ridicule the other side. So let's think about, well, what might Republicans care about? They might care about their companies being extremely successful in the long term. So this is why when I come to, and I give a lot of talks on sustainability and grow the pie to companies, how do I give those talks? I don't try to guilt trip them into saying, you need to do this, you have a moral obligation. Who am I to tell you what your moral obligations are? My morals might not be better than yours, but I'm saying based on some evidence, this is good for your company's long-term success. And similarly, if you think about China's climate commitment, some people might be skeptical about China making some certain commitments, but China has historically always wanted to pursue world domination and technological domination. Now, maybe that's not for purely positive and altruistic reasons, but they have an incentive to do this, and this is why China's been really behind electric cars. Is it necessarily because they think a lot about the impact on climate change? Well, maybe, but maybe not. They just want to dominate an area which is going to be big, and so some of the messages given there is, well, these are areas which are going to be growth areas in the future, so let's try to support the Chinese electric vehicle industry, and that is speaking a language with which some of the politicians will resonate with.
Interesting. So just bearing those kind of the good faith anti-ESG advocates out there in mind, there is a general sense from what I read of a feeling of being cancelled, being lectured. Are we being like kind of pro-ESG, actually pro-ESG people, are we being too kind of monolithic in our descriptions of sustainability, or like how can we be getting more nuance into this debate?
I think we are being too monolithic, and I think we often view sustainability with a Western lens, or even a weird lens, which is Western, educated, industrialised, rich and democratic. So a few months ago I was at the World Economic Forum in Dubai, and we were having a discussion about a just transition. And then a lady from Africa got up and she says, in Africa, 600 million people have no access to electricity. You folks in the West, you talk about a just transition, 600 million of my fellow citizens have nothing to transition from. And so this doesn't mean that climate is not important, but this means that when we think about the scale and the pace of decarbonisation, we also do recognise that 600 million people do not have the access to electricity, which has been one of the drivers of economic growth. If we're to have this blunt message, not considering the effect on, say, the job of a 55-year-old coal worker, where none of us might even know such a worker, then this is something where if our message is shoving something down people's throat without recognising the trade-offs, then we become relatively less effective. So I think we can still be completely serious about climate being a big issue, but not see it in such black and white terms. Yes, there are costs, but even if they're costs, we still want to go ahead because it's so urgent. Just like if a medicine was to have side effects, it is responsible for a doctor to draw attention to those side effects. You will still take the medicine because the illness is so important that you're willing to pay that cost. But for some reason here, we're trying to pretend that things don't have any side effects, when I do think reasonable people are willing to take the medicine if there are side effects, and in particular, if governments take certain actions to try to compensate those who are losing from things such as too rapid decarbonisation and job losses.
And you have an interesting concept there, kind of winning and losing. One of the points that you you make in the book is that evidence actually isn't everything. Are we being kind of too focused on trying to boil everything down in an ESG sense into numbers, into data? Isn't there a place for philosophy? Isn't there a place for different types of ethics? And we judge it upon, we judge particular standards, particular ideas on ethical principles or philosophical principles rather than trying to get it down into numbers.
Absolutely. So I think too many times we try to highlight sustainability by looking at the financial case. And I have to admit myself, I sometimes use that case. I say, well, there's certain dimensions of sustainability where the evidence suggests it is financially profitable in the long term. But I also admit this is not true for every type of sustainability. So let's take diversity, equity, inclusion. So sometimes people will boil this down to just demographic diversity, and they'll quote McKinsey or BlackRock studies showing that demographic diversity pays off. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So those pieces of research have major flaws in them, but are accepted uncritically due to confirmation bias. But let's say they were true. Right? If people are only doing diversity because you make money out of it, then they might do gender and ethnic diversity. But is there any study showing that diversity in terms of inclusion of disabled people improves financial returns? Or socioeconomic diversity if you hire people who are first-generation college students? Or diversity in appearance, right? How many tattooed people do you see working for investment banks? And there's no study showing that that is a dimension of diversity. So if we only reduce it to what we can show with particular data, there might be other things that we might want to pursue where there is no data behind it, and so we don't do this. And just in life, we do many, many things for non-financial reasons or non-instrumental reasons. So why might you play football rather than rugby? It is not through scientific evidence showing that the effect of football is better on your health, nor that through football you meet more wealthy people and this is now a better network to help you get jobs in the future. You might just love football, right? Or football is just closer to you, it's more convenient. You might make decisions out of convenience rather than the impact on your future earnings. And so I think for certain things in sustainability where there is no evidence or the only evidence there is not particularly reliable, you might just say, I want my organisation to have a diverse mix of people. I think this is the right thing to do, not I'm going to do this because I'm going to make more money out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of gets us into the last section of the conversation was talking about, which is the last section of your book, which is fantastic, which is the solutions part. We've done a lot of kind of discussions on the problems with information. Good to finish off with some discussion of possible solutions. One of which you mentioned earlier on is trying to take the opposite view on things, trying to think about what you would, how you would argue against something. So just to ask kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek, should I be reading more from like climate deniers?
So certainly not from climate deniers who are not basing their stuff on evidence, because then they're just making things up which are based on ideology. But if there are people who are showing that there are nuances within climate, so if they're trying to highlight the trade-offs, so that's not denying the science of climate change, right? So that science, my reading of it is pretty very clear that as climate change is man-made and we need to do something about it. What is not so clear is the extent of the trade-offs. And if there was evidence suggesting that actually too rapid decarbonisation would lead to job losses and the human version of stranded assets, then I would take that seriously. So it might not be direct contradictions, particularly if something has been shown pretty convincingly by the scientists, but it might be highlighting the cost of particular actions, and so this would guide us not so much in terms of the different end goal, but the different ways to achieve that goal. And I think this is a broader point which is really important. So sometimes when we have disagreements with people, we think these are bad people. They want something different from us. So if I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican, you want to destroy the country. I'm somebody who really cares about the future. It might be that a Republican thinks there's a different way to get to a prosperous US. Maybe they think tax cuts are better, and maybe I think tax raises are better, but it may well be that we have different perspectives on how to achieve a given outcome rather than different outcomes. And if we have that shared objective, then we can learn from each other rather than viewing the other person as the enemy.
Okay. I think we've talked quite a bit about the idea of diversity in this conversation. Is there a way of reading intelligently the opposite sides of the argument to diversity, because I think we agree diversity is going to be it is a better thing just in general. How would you go about reading the opposite side of that argument?
Yes, is that the way that diversity has typically been implemented is focusing purely on demographic diversity. And so why? That's just easy, right? This means that as a investor, you see some investors who say, we're going to automatically vote against this director because they're not female or an ethnic minority. But that reduces the totality, the humanity of a person into just the gender and ethnicity. This says that if you're a white male, you add nothing in terms of diversity to a company, irrespective of whether you're the first person in your country ever to go to university. Maybe you're an expat because your parents were living overseas and therefore you've got lots of wider experiences than I do, as an ethnic minority who's only lived in the UK and the US, two very developed nations. Maybe it's that you studied humanities at university and everybody else studied STEM subjects. Maybe you came from a marketing background and everybody else is in finance. So there's so many different other things in a person, and I think just to reduce it to two easy things, which makes things easy for investors or for managers thinking of who to promote, you can just look at some very observable statistics and not get to understand the person.
And the idea there of cognitive diversity, like it isn't just like your race, colour, creed, it's about how you think about things. There's a really good story in the book on how John F. Kennedy, essentially, how cognitive diversity saved the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
Could you kind of dig into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm sure that most readers will know of this, but just in case that they don't, this is when the US spotted some missiles being installed in Cuba during the time of Fidel Castro and also US-USSR tensions, and Cuba was a USSR sympathiser. So the concern was, well, there could be an attack here, so what should we do? The military immediately wanted to bomb the missile sites. But what Kennedy did is he set up an ExComm, an executive committee of the National Security Council. This comprised of, I think, 14 white males. So there was no demographic diversity. At the time, sadly, there was just far less demographic diversity right now. But because demographic diversity does not necessarily tally up with cognitive diversity, this group of demographically homogeneous people actually achieved a good outcome because of the diversity of thinking. So yes, there were military leaders there, but there were also people who were quite sceptical of military action, and one was Kennedy himself. So he was considered quite negatively compared to his predecessor. Eisenhower was a 5-star general, whereas Kennedy was a much more lower ranked. He was known as a patrol boat skipper, but because he was not so senior in the army, he was not immediately attuned to always having a military solution. And some of his fellow members were also people who saw the dangers of using hard power as well as its benefits. So what they said was, hold on, rather than thinking, yes, we'll attack, let's come up with battle plans and the best way to attack, let's think, well, are there alternative solutions here? And so what ExComm did is it came up with 6 different alternatives, and then it debated each one. Then it whittled them down to 2. And then the 2 were either the attack or the blockade, which is what they eventually went with. And they divided ExComm into 2 teams. They got one of them to present the arguments for the attack, the other for the blockade. They swapped papers, then criticised each other, and then revised the papers to take into account the criticism. So that has many things which can be applied today. So this is the idea of just looking, brainstorming all possible solutions before anchoring on a particular one. It involves the idea of a devil's advocate, or sometimes known as a red team, where you have people critiquing a different idea and also responding to feedback. And then when feedback is given, which is critical, you're not defensive about it. You don't think the person is poking holes in it because they're being nasty to you. They also want what is good for the overall country, but they're just trying to provide a different perspective in order to try to help out with the fact that the people who came up with the solution might have blind spots, and true diversity of thought is having other people who can notice the blind spots that you have.
In kind of purpose-driven organisations, you tend to have people who are attracted to that purpose. So that can give a very good kind of unity of purpose, unity of spirit, but it will take away from this type of diversity of ideas that you're talking about. How in kind of mission-focused organisations can we be getting useful diversity, but keeping that common purpose, that common mission?
I think it's to disentangle the two things that are frequently conflated, which is the mission, the objective, with the journey, how to get there. So it can be people completely agree on the objective, but they have different views as to how best to achieve that objective. For example, in a football team, the goal is to win, to score as many goals as possible. Sometimes people might say, I want a passing strategy or a pressing strategy or a more direct style. With my co-authors, you always want to get the paper published. I have more technical co-authors, often on papers, and they might want to make the paper a bit more technical and add additional proofs and other technical steps. I, as a more big picture person, might say, well, actually, that might lose some of our audience. I will typically try to always co-author with more detail level people than me. I don't want lots of architects and very few builders. I typically architect, and I have a lot of builders doing the more technical work in a way that I would not be able to do to the same quality as myself. And that is a true type of cognitive diversity. And the combination of both architects and builders, they could all be male. They could all be white males. They could all be Asian males. It doesn't matter. What matters is they all have different skills from me, and that will hopefully achieve a better outcome.
Well, as you may remember from last time, what we typically try and do at the end, final question, is a little bit of advice. So if I can be cheeky and offer my own piece of advice first, which is read the book. To everyone out there, it's a fantastic book. You will generally feel smarter at the end of reading it. But if I can ask you for some advice for listeners and viewers out there, how would you suggest to people to get better at kind of sniffing out the truth?
So if you hear a piece of evidence that you like, imagine it found the opposite results, and then see how you would attack it, and then think about whether those attacks are still valid, even though the research finds what you do like. So let's give a practical example. So let's say this evening, I'd like lots of excuses to drink red wine. So I Google why red wine is good for your health, and I find a lot of studies claiming it is. Now, let me assume that the studies found the opposite. Red wine is correlated with a shorter life. How might I attack it? Well, I might say the people who drink red wine, they are poorer people. They can't afford champagne or expensive spirits. And it could be poverty, not red wine, which causes the shorter life, because I can't afford as good healthcare. So now that I've alerted myself to the fact that poverty could be another driver, an alternative explanation, think about whether it continues to apply despite the finding being in the direction I want. So what's the direction I want? Red wine is correlated with longer life. Well, maybe wealthier people can afford red wine because others might be affording alcopops or cheap beer. Is that what's driving the outcome? And so what this also highlights is that the solutions to misinformation are all within ourselves. They're not statistical pyrotechnics. The book does not contain many equations. I don't think it contains a single equation. And often when I post something on LinkedIn, which might be a study that people don't like, they will have no shortage of comments as to why correlation is not causation. So we know that, and yet we switch off those critical thinking faculties when we see something that we do like. So what I'm trying to encourage in the book is for you to use the knowledge, the discernment that you already have within yourselves, but not apply it selectively only when you want to dismiss something, or to apply it when you want something to be true.
Interesting, yeah. So lean into, when you instinctively react against something, when you feel yourself instinctively leaning into something, pretend that actually you're going the opposite direction, and use those instincts to be kind of critically analysing what you're reading. That's great.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alex. Great conversation.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. These are conversations that you just can't afford to miss.